to take you now to the Pentagon, where Department of Defense Press Secretary Major General Pat Ryder is speaking to reporters. This, as we learned, the Defense Secretary was treated for prostate cancer. Let's watch.
I will read that full statement. This is a statement from Dr. John Maddox, Trauma Medical Director, and Dr. Gregory Chestnut, Center for Prostate Disease Research of the Murtha Center Director at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. Beginning the statement. As part of Secretary Austin's routinely recommended health screening, he has undergone regular prostate-specific antigen PSA surveillance. Changes in his laboratory evaluation in early December 2023 identified prostate cancer, which required treatment. On December 22, 2023, after consultation with his medical team, he was admitted to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and underwent a minimally invasive surgical procedure called a prostatectomy to treat and cure prostate cancer. He was under general anesthesia during this procedure. Secretary Austin recovered uneventfully from his surgery and returned home the next morning. His prostate cancer was detected early, and his prognosis is excellent. On January 1, 2024, Secretary Austin was admitted to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center with complications from the December 22nd procedure, including nausea with severe abdominal, hip, and leg pain. Initial evaluation revealed a urinary tract infection. On January 2, the decision was made to transfer him to the ICU for close monitoring and a higher level of care. Further evaluation revealed abdominal fluid collections impairing the function of his small intestines. This resulted in the backup of his intestinal contents, which was treated by placing a tube through his nose to drain his stomach. The abdominal fluid collections were drained by non-surgical drain placement. He's progressed steadily throughout his stay. His infection is cleared. He continues to make progress, and we anticipate a full recovery, although this can be a slow process. During this stay, Secretary Austin never lost consciousness and never underwent general anesthesia. Prostate cancer is the most common cause of cancer among American men, and it impacts 1 in every 8 men and 1 in every 6 African American men during their lifetime. Despite the frequency of prostate cancer, discussions about screening, treatment, and support are often deeply personal and private ones. Early screening is important for detection and treatment of prostate cancer, and people should talk to their doctors to see what screening is appropriate for them. End statement. Secretary Austin continues to recover well and remains in good spirits. He's in contact with his senior staff and has full access to required secure communications capabilities and continues to monitor DoD's day-to-day operations worldwide. At this time, I do not have any information to provide in terms of when he might be released from the hospital, but we'll be sure to keep you updated. And until then, we will continue to release daily status updates on his condition. We in the Department of Defense, of course, wish him a speedy recovery. The Department recognizes the understandable concerns expressed by the public, Congress, and the news media in terms of notification timelines and DoD transparency. And I want to underscore again that Secretary Austin has taken responsibility for the issues with transparency, and the Department is taking immediate steps to improve our notification procedures. Yesterday, the Secretary's Chief of Staff directed the DoD's Director of Administration and Management to conduct a 30-day review of the Department's notification process for assumption of functions and duties of the Secretary of Defense. While the review is underway and effective immediately, the Chief of Staff also directed several actions to ensure increased situational awareness about any transfer of authorities from the Secretary of Defense, to include ensuring that the DoD General Counsel, the Chairman and Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the combatant commanders, the service secretaries, the service chief of staffs, the White House Situation Room, and senior staff of the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Defense are all notified, and that the notification for transfer of authorities includes an explanation of the reason. We'll keep you updated regarding the results of the review and any additional significant changes to process and procedures as appropriate. And as I highlighted to many of you yesterday, nothing is more important to the Secretary of Defense and the Department of Defense than the trust and confidence of the American people and the public we serve, and will continue to work hard every day to earn and deserve that trust. Separately, Deputy Secretary Kathleen Hicks is traveling today en route to U.S. Space Command headquarters at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado. Tomorrow, she'll preside over the U.S. Space Command change of command at 12 p.m. Eastern Time between General James Dickinson and Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting. The event will be live streamed on Divids and on defense.gov. Also, Dr. Michael Chase, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, began talks yesterday with People's Republic of China Major General Song Yan-cho, Deputy Director of the Central Military Commission Office for International Military Cooperation, at the Pentagon for the 17th U.S. PRC Defense Policy Coordination Talks. Those meetings conclude today, and we'll issue a readout later this afternoon. Finally, as some of you may be aware, the United States of America Vietnam War Commemoration was launched in 2012, authorized by Congress under the Secretary of Defense in support of a national 50th anniversary commemoration to help thank the nation's Vietnam veterans and their families for their service and sacrifice on behalf of our nation. Notably, thousands of organizations known as commemorative partners have joined the U.S. Vietnam War Commemoration to honor America's 7 million Vietnam veterans, both at home and abroad, and the 10 million families of all those who served. This Saturday, January 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern, a special commemoration of the service, courage, and legacy of Vietnam War veterans and Gold Star families, and a renewal of American commitment to account for those heroes who may remain missing 50 years after the war's end, will be observed at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., hosted by a commemorative partner, the Air and Space Forces Association, and 40 supporting organizations. The event is open to the public and will also be live streamed. For more details, I'd refer you to the Air and Space Forces Association or National Cathedral websites. And with that, I will take your questions. We'll start with Associated Press. Tara.
Hi, General Ryder. Thank you for doing this. Have you or the staff had a chance to speak to the Secretary, and has he shared at all why he was reluctant to make his condition public until now? And then, given the seriousness of his treatment, do you suspect that he might have to take a step back from some of the more rigorous parts of his job, such as a lot of the overseas travel he's been doing, and maybe delegate that to Secretary Hicks?
The staff has been in contact with the Secretary. I have not personally spoken to the Secretary, but I do know, for example, that he's in regular communication with his Chief of Staff. As for his travel schedule, of course, I don't have anything to announce. I can tell you that he is actively engaged in his duties, as I highlighted, and fully engaged. And so, completely confident in that, and we'll obviously keep you updated in terms of his status in the hospital.
Has he expressed at all why he was reluctant to share what he was going through until now?
I don't have that specifically from the Secretary, Tara, but obviously, as I highlighted, it's prostate cancer and the associated procedures are obviously deeply personal. And so, again, we'll continue to work hard to make sure that we're being as transparent as possible moving forward. And again, wish the Secretary a speedy recovery.
And then just last, there's still a lot of questions on the process about all of the notification that didn't happen. When he was taken by ambulance to Walter Reed and had personal security detail with him, why at that point wasn't there like a call to an operations center or something that would have triggered a greater awareness that he was getting medical care?
Yeah, so again, a fair question, and for the sake of not doing the review here from the podium, as I highlighted, the Director of Administration and Management has been directed to lead a thorough review to look at exactly those kinds of questions, the relevant facts and circumstances during the period in question, to evaluate the processes and procedures by which the Deputy Secretary of Defense was notified, and the associated timeline. So again, we'll commit to being as transparent as we can in terms of the results of that review. Let me go to Liz here.
Thanks, Pat. The Chief of Staff and the Senior Military Advisor were both told on Tuesday that Secretary Austin was in the hospital. Could the Chief of Staff have asked the SMA to make the proper notifications for her since she was sick with the flu?
Yeah, again, we fully recognize that there are going to be many questions in terms of notification timelines as well as the transparency issues that we've highlighted. So I really think that this review is going to help us get to ground truth in a holistic way so that we can learn from it, importantly, but also ensure that we're doing better next time. So I think we really need to allow this review to run its course in order to do that. In the meantime, we've taken some immediate steps, as I highlighted at the top.
I mean, would that have been under procedure for the SMA to notify the White House National Security Advisor?
Again, certainly, we want to make sure that notifications are happening in a timely way. And in this way, as we've acknowledged, there were some shortfalls. And so it's important that we go back and look at what those shortfalls were, what could have been done better, and make sure that going forward, we're improving those processes. So again, this review will help us. Let me go to Courtney.
Do you still think it's appropriate to call his medical procedure on December 22nd the prostatectomy elective medical procedure if it was treating prostate cancer?
So I'm going to defer to medical officials on this. Again, this is we released this information as soon as we had it, and so again, I'm going to refer back to the statement, and going forward, we'll use that as the baseline in terms of describing. But in this particular case, as soon as we had the information made available to us, we provided it to you.
It seems frankly like you were deceived by telling everyone that it was an elective medical procedure, and by telling that to the public. I mean, it doesn't seem elective if he had prostate cancer and this was treating it.
Yeah, I'm not a medical professional. Again, we're going to try to provide you with the most information we have as quickly as we have it, and recognizing that as I say that, we could have done a better job last week. So, again, we have this information now from these medical professionals. And I think that, it will go a long way in terms of helping to understand the situation and what needs to be done going forward.
And when was President Biden notified that the secretary was diagnosed with prostate cancer?
I'd have to refer you to the White House. I just don't know. Natasha.
Thank you, General Ryder. So the memo that was drafted by Austin's chief of staff that lays out the 30-day review that's going to be done, it doesn't mention the initial December 22nd hospital stay. So has the Pentagon determined that in that instance all appropriate notification procedures were followed, despite the Deputy Secretary of the White House not being notified that he was undergoing surgery, which we now know that he was under general anesthesia for?
Yeah, I think that the information that we gather and the lessons that we learn from the period from last week will be applicable across the board, right? So would similarly apply to the situation on December 22nd. The bottom line is ensuring that if there is a transfer of authority, making sure that the appropriate senior leaders in the chain of command know, and that importantly, there's a rationale to be able to provide some perspective in terms of why these transfers of authority are occurring. So certainly lessons learned from that will be applied to transfers of authority in the future.
And just to be clear, prior to him going under general anesthesia, he transferred his authorities to the Deputy Secretary?
That is correct. Correct. Come over here, Laura, and then I'll go to Idris.
Thank you. Just again, when this happened in December, whose decision was it not to alert the president that the defense secretary had prostate cancer?
Again, as far as the situation in terms of what the elective surgery was and the secretary's condition, we're providing that information to you as we've received it. We received that this afternoon, and we're providing it to you now. So I'll just leave it there.
I mean, clearly you didn't know. Did the chief of staff know?
I'm not going to go into the specifics on who specifically knew what, when, and where. Again, our review will help us better understand that, other than to say, as soon as we had this information to make available, we provided it. We got it this afternoon and provided it literally minutes before I stepped in here.
And just one last one. Did he lose consciousness at all during the December 22nd surgery?
To my knowledge, no. Idris.
Just a couple of questions. Has the secretary been on any medication that might alter his judgment in either of those hospital visits?
So, Idris, I have no indications. Again, I have no indications anything that would affect his decision-making abilities. He's obviously, as I highlighted in the statement, at no time has he been unconscious or under general anesthesia, and of course is in the presence of medical professionals for the duration. When he resumed full duties on Friday evening, that was in consultation with medical professionals. And as we've highlighted in the press releases that we've put out, he continues to stay very actively engaged with his senior staff and is making important decisions about national security and defense.
Has he asked his chief of staff to resign, or has she offered to resign?
No.
And then lastly, sorry, very quickly, the White House Chief of Staff put out a statement to different cabinet secretaries about procedures. Does the secretary believe that he has become a distraction for the administration in which he serves during an election year?
Yeah, the secretary continues to remain focused on recovering, but more importantly, on carrying out his duties as Secretary of Defense and defending the nation. Let me go to Tom, and then we'll go to Carl.
Thank you. Different topics, two questions. First of all, Secretary Blinken today said the death toll in Gaza was far too high, and Senator Angus King said Israel's bombing campaign has reached the point of diminishing returns. Does the Pentagon agree with these assessments? That's my first question, and I have a second one too.
Sure. Well, as we've said for a long time, any civilian death is a tragedy. And of course, the Secretary and others, as we've engaged with our Israeli partners, have continued to encourage them to do everything possible to mitigate civilian harm, and we'll continue to do that. Again, no one wants to see innocent civilians killed in this conflict, whether they be Palestinian or Israeli, and so we'll continue to work toward that end.
Thank you. Second question. Mike McCall at the weekend issued a statement condemning what he said was U.S. weakness in dealing with the Houthi threat in the Red Sea. Do you have any updates on Operation Prosperity Guardian you can share? And do you have any reaction to the claim that the U.S. is being too weak?
The U.S. is not being too weak. We are working very actively with international partners to address the Houthi threat. Operation Prosperity Guardian is bringing together more than 20 nations to help safeguard international commerce and mariners that are transiting the Red Sea. And we will continue to work very closely with those partners to help deter by presence, but also helping to safeguard those ships that are transiting. Additionally, as you saw last week, a statement was put out by multiple nations highlighting that there will be consequences for any type of continued Houthi attacks. And so that warning still applies. I'm not going to speculate or get into hypotheticals about what we may or may not do as it pertains to or as it relates to addressing those issues, other than to say it should be taken very seriously. Carla?
Thank you. First of all, the Secretary is expected to host an honor cordon on Thursday here at the Pentagon. Has that changed? Has that been canceled? Is the Pentagon preparing for somebody else to host this in his stead?
Carla, so I don't have the specific details on the honor cordon in front of me, other than to say again, we will continue to assess the Secretary's schedule in terms of here at the Pentagon, and certainly as we have updates or if things need to be delegated, we'll certainly do that as appropriate. The business of the department, the day-to-day business, obviously continues, and the Secretary, of course, is conducting his duties from the hospital. And so we'll be sure to keep you and others updated in terms of who may be carrying out those specific duties or functions, or if we have to reschedule things. But right now, I just don't have any specifics.
And just so I understand the timeline, President Biden did not find out that Austin was in the hospital until Thursday, correct?
Correct.
And we don't know at this time when President Biden was notified, or if he was notified before Thursday, that the Secretary had prostate cancer, correct? That's still unanswered?
I'd have to refer you to the White House. I don't want to get into who was telling the President what and when.
Okay. And so why did it take so long to get to President Biden, and why did the statement take so long when the Chief of Staff returned on Thursday? Assuming she returned on Thursday morning, the statement did not come out until Friday after 5, so that's 2 full business days. What was the delay in this statement? We usually get statements about strikes or meetings much, much earlier.
Yeah, thanks. I'll provide you a broad overview. I covered a lot of this during the gaggle yesterday, but I recognize that not everybody was there. And so, when the notifications occurred to the staff on Tuesday, because the Secretary's chief of staff was ill with the flu, it impacted a delay in reporting it to the Deputy Secretary's staff and to the National Security Advisor. Again, we recognize that there were some shortfalls in this in terms of the obvious question about delegation. And so again, that's what this review is going to help us look at, is where we can improve processes to ensure these kinds of things don't happen again going into the future. the bottom line is,
I understand that.
yep.
Post Thursday, post her return on Thursday, it still took from all day Thursday and all day Friday to get a statement out. That's where I'm wondering where the delay was there as well.
Yeah, again, this goes back to what we'll look at, but we recognize that we have to do a better job in terms of the timeliness and the transparency when it comes to especially the Secretary's health. And again, we're committed to making sure that we don't do this again and that we do a better job next time. Let me get some other questions. Joseph.
Thanks. Could you provide any updates on the 3 service members that were injured in the Christmas Day attack?
Joseph, I'd have to refer you to the Army. I don't have those.
And, could you give us the latest numbers of attacks in Iraq and Syria?
Sure. So that there's since January 4, let's see here, there has been 9 attacks since January 4. There's been 127 attacks total, 52 in Iraq, 75 in Syria.
And then just finally, DOD and you previously said that the Pentagon was looking into reports of Israeli use of white phosphorus in Lebanon. I believe it's November, October. I was wondering if there's any updates on that.
I don't have any updates. I haven't seen anything substantive come back, but I don't have any updates on that.
Are you still looking into it, or have you closed that?
I want to. I'd refer you to the Israelis. Obviously, they would know whether they did or not. But I'm not aware of any updates or anything significant coming back at this stage. Sir.
Thank you, General. Yesterday you talked about your presence in Iraq. My question is that, do you have a deadline for the U.S. withdrawal in Iraq? If not, then how long are you going to stay? Are you going to stay as long as the ISIS threats remain, or it's totally up to the Iraqi government if they want you to stay or leave the country?
Yeah. So, we are in Iraq at the invitation of the government of Iraq. And as you highlight, we remain singularly focused on the defeat ISIS mission. We do remain in close consultation with the Iraqi government when it comes to U.S. force presence, in particular the safety and security of those forces. And so we are engaged in a coordinated and deliberate process with the government of Iraq to discuss the evolution of that mission in a manner that preserves these gains against ISIS and helps to ensure that they can never come back. So I'm not going to speculate or get into internal Iraqi government discussions, but certainly we'll continue to consult closely with our Iraqi partners.
And there's no deadline for that presence in Iraq?
Well, again, we are there at the invitation of the government of Iraq. Rio.
Thank you, General. 2 questions on the Indo-Pacific. The first on Japan. Can you give us any update on the U.S. assistance in Japan's disaster relief operations after the major earthquake in early January?
So we do remain in close communication with the government of Japan. We are ready to assist if asked. At this time, to my knowledge, there's not been any specific requests, but we'll, of course, continue to keep you updated.
Okay. Separately on Taiwan, the presidential election will take place in Taiwan on Saturday. China said this election is a choice between conflict and peace. So how concerned is the Pentagon that China might step up pressure campaign against Taiwan, depending on the outcome of the election?
Yeah, so we strongly support Taiwan's free and fair elections, which we view as a model for democracy not only in the region but also globally. And the United States does not take sides in Taiwan's elections. We're committed to fair treatment of the candidates. Our policy on Taiwan will remain the same regardless of which party is in power, and we look forward to working with whomever Taiwan voters elect. The U.S.-China, One China policy, as you know, Rio, will continue to be guided by the Taiwan's Relation Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. Fadi.
Thank you, General. So you've been addressing the campaign against ISIS in Iraq. It seems the Pentagon has some concerns about maybe the reemergence of ISIS. How would you assess the threat of ISIS today in Iraq?
So it's really interesting having watched this over time. So, ISIS in Iraq and Syria have been largely suppressed. I think it's one of those things, though, that you have to keep after, obviously. One of the major challenges, of course, is the Ahal detention facility, which, of course, we continue to work with coalition and countries around the world to address that. Post-counter-ISIS campaign, the active operations when ISIS was defeated, essentially in Syria, what we've seen is ISIS essentially look to metastasize elsewhere, most notably in the African continent, but then also in places like Afghanistan. And so this is, really not only an Iraq and Syria challenge, but it's a broader regional, and in some cases a global challenge. And so you can't wish it away. We've got to continue to keep pressure on ISIS to prevent a resurgence, because as they demonstrated back in 2014.
You have been listening to Department of Defense Press Secretary Major General Pat Ryder speak from the Pentagon. Ryder discussed Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin being treated for prostate cancer, including undergoing a procedure for it in late December at Walter Reed Medical Center. He also explained why the secretary returned to the hospital last week. Ryder fielded questions as well about why members of the public and the White House were not told about the situation sooner. CBS News national security correspondent David Martin joins us now from the Pentagon. David, some new information emerging. What more do we know now from Pentagon officials and from officials at Walter Reed?
Well, it's a lot more information. It's the first really substantive information we've gotten about what exactly was ailing the Secretary of Defense. That was a very lengthy statement and very detailed statement, and let me just give you the highlights as I understand them. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer in early December. He went into Walter Reed Hospital on the 22nd of December for prostate surgery, went home on the 23rd of December and was recovering from home when on New Year's Day, January 1st, he started experiencing nausea and severe pain in his abdomen, his hip, and his leg. He was rushed back to the hospital by ambulance, where he was diagnosed with a urinary tract infection. Then he started having a buildup of fluid in his abdomen, which was blocking his small intestinal tract. So they admitted him to the ICU and began draining his stomach through a hose that is put down his nose. He was never unconscious or under anesthesia during this procedure, but as I describe it, you can understand he was a pretty miserable human being in there, and that is when he transferred authority to his deputy to carry out all of his duties as Secretary of Defense, which makes him one of the most powerful people in the world. So we now know pretty much what happened to Lloyd Austin. What we don't know yet is why it took 3 days for the Pentagon to tell the President of the United States, the one person above Lloyd Austin in the military chain of command, why it took 3 days to tell the President of the United States that his most important commander was in the ICU and unable to discharge his functions as Secretary of Defense. And now there are going to be a number of reviews into that. The Pentagon ordered one last night, a 30-day review, and has already ordered the implementation of interim procedures, one of which is that whenever the Secretary of Defense has to transfer his authority to his deputy, whether it's because, in this case, of hospitalization or simply because he's on a helicopter for 30 minutes and no longer has all of the secure communications that travel with the Secretary of Defense, an email has to go out to all the senior members of the Defense Department, plus the White House Situation Room. And once it goes to the White House Situation Room, then that should be sufficient for the President of the United States to be notified.
David, just for my clarification here, on December 22nd, when the Secretary first went into Walter Reed to have that surgery that you described to treat his prostate cancer, the statement from the doctors at Walter Reed says that he was under general anesthesia. Do we know, was the White House informed at that time?
We do not. And I hope that is one question that the White House will answer today. What we know is that he knew he was going to be out of commission while he was undergoing surgery, and he did transfer authority to his Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, for the time of that surgery and until he came out and was back home on the 23rd. What we don't know is what he told her. He could have told her, I'm going into the hospital and I need you to take over for a day, or he could have been more specific about his actual diagnosis. I mean, the fact is that Lloyd Austin is just a very private man. This is private stuff, and he just didn't tell a lot of people what was going on.
David, we heard in that Pentagon briefing, Major General Pat Ryder say at one point, quote, "We could have done a better job last week," end quote. For people who are just maybe now coming to learn the details of this and starting to pay attention to this, they may wonder why this matters. Can you just give us some context here? When a Defense Secretary of the United States of America is out of commission, is that something that, say, our adversaries overseas would be aware of or paying close attention to?
It is certainly something that they would be tracking. Whether or not they can detect it when it happens, I don't know. But look, a chain of command is the most important part of any military operation. And it's a very, very simple chain of command. President of the United States, Secretary of Defense, commander in the field. And it's made that simple because the operations themselves are so complex. And if you have a bunch of different people who think they're in charge, it just makes everything worse. So imagine if you're the President of the United States and you've ordered a military operation and something goes wrong with it. Civilians get killed. You encounter way more opposition than you thought. It turns into a real firefight. The President says, get me the Secretary of Defense. And then for the first time, he learns out that his Secretary of Defense is in the ICU. That's obviously not the way the system is supposed to work. And they have procedures which supposedly, if followed, would prevent that from happening. In this case, the procedures just weren't followed.
David Martin at the Pentagon for us. David, thank you.
Sure thing.